My fingers trembled as I held the prenatal vitamins in one hand and my birth control pills in the other. Comparing the shapes and colors, they were identical. For 3 months, I'd been taking what I thought was contraception, but Derek had been methodically replacing every single pill with fertility supplements, thinking I'd never notice. What he didn't know was that I'd been planning my own form of justice, and his precious paternity test results were about to reveal a truth that would shatter his entire world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in our pristine Denver townhouse, the kind of place Derek insisted we needed to project success to his corporate clients. I'd been feeling nauseous for weeks, attributing it to stress from my demanding job at the marketing firm, but when my period was late, a creeping suspicion began to form. Standing in our marble bathroom staring at the positive pregnancy test, my first emotion wasn't joy or panic, it was confusion. We'd been so careful, or so I thought. I'd been taking my pills religiously, the same routine every morning with my coffee, the same pink compact sitting on the bathroom counter where it had lived for the past 5 years of our marriage. But as I held that test, something nagged at me. The pills had looked slightly different lately, maybe a shade lighter, but I'd dismissed it as a manufacturing variation. Now, with this test confirming my worst fears, I decided to investigate. The prenatal vitamins were hidden in Derek's home office, tucked behind his law books in a place he thought I'd never look. But I'd been doing a lot of looking lately, ever since I'd started suspecting that my husband of 5 years wasn't the man I'd married. The bottle was nearly empty, which meant he'd been planning this deception for months. Each pill was an exact match to my birth control, down to the tiny manufacturer's mark that most people would never notice. My hands shook as I sat in his leather chair, surrounded by his awards and certificates, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. Derek had been sabotaging my reproductive choices while I slept beside him every night, trusting him completely. The man who'd promised to respect my decision to wait until we were financially stable before having children had been systematically undermining my autonomy for months. The worst part was remembering all the conversations we'd had about time, how he'd nodded understandingly when I'd expressed my concerns about starting a family too soon, how he'd agreed that waiting made sense given my career trajectory and our mortgage. All lies, all manipulation. While I'd been focused on building the marketing campaign that could earn me a promotion, he'd been waging a secret war against my body and my choices. I thought back to the subtle changes in his behavior over the past few months. The way he'd started bringing me coffee in bed, always insisting I take my pill first thing in the morning while he watched. The strange smile he'd get when I'd mention feeling tired or emotional. The way he'd started talking more frequently about his colleague's new baby, dropping hints about how wonderful it would be to start our own family soon. It had all seemed sweet and thoughtful at the time, but now I recognized it for what it was, a calculated campaign of reproductive coercion. The pregnancy explained so many things that had been puzzling me. The exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure, the way certain smells had started making me queasy, the tenderness in my breast that I'd attributed to stress. Derek had been watching me experience these symptoms, knowing exactly what was causing them, and saying nothing. Worse than saying nothing, he'd been actively encouraging me to dismiss them, suggesting I was just working too hard, maybe I needed to consider cutting back on my career ambition. That evening, Derek came home from his law firm with his usual confident stride, loosening his tie as he called out his standard greeting. I was sitting at our kitchen island, the pregnancy test hidden in my pocket, my face carefully composed into the same pleasant expression I'd worn for months, while he'd been poisoning me with his deception. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, dropping a kiss on my forehead, in the same patronizing way he'd been doing lately, like I was a child who needed his protection and guidance. "Interesting," I replied, watching his face carefully. "I've been thinking about that conversation we had last week about starting a family." His eyes lit up with an eagerness that now made my stomach turn. "Oh? Have you changed your mind about waiting?" The casual way he said it, as if my reproductive choices were simply a matter of changing my mind rather than making informed decisions about my own body, crystallized everything that was wrong with our marriage. I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife, the supportive partner, that I'd missed how systematically he'd been eroding my agency in our relationship. I've been doing some research, I continued, pulling out my phone and pretending to scroll through pregnancy websites. Did you know that prenatal vitamins can sometimes look exactly like birth control pills? The color drained from his face so quickly that for a moment I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and I could practically see his legal mind scrambling for a defense, a way to spin this that wouldn't implicate him completely. That's interesting, he managed, but his voice had gone up an octave, the way it always did when he was lying. Very interesting, I agreed, standing up and walking to where he stood frozen by the kitchen counter. Almost as interesting as finding a bottle of prenatal vitamins hidden in your office. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's carefully constructed facade crumbled before my eyes, revealing the calculating stranger who'd been sharing my bed and manipulating my body for months. He didn't even try to deny it, which somehow made it worse. At least a lie would have shown some respect for my intelligence. Chloe, I can explain, he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. Can you? Can you explain how you thought it was acceptable to tamper with my medication? Can you explain how you justified violating my reproductive autonomy? Can you explain how you looked me in the eye every morning and watched me take pills that you'd switched without my knowledge or consent? His face cycled through several expressions: guilt, defensiveness, and finally, the anger that I'd come to recognize as his default response when caught in wrongdoing. You're being dramatic, Chloe. We're married. We've talked about having children. I just thought you thought that you knew better than me what should happen to my body, that your timeline mattered more than mine, that my consent was optional as long as we were married. It's not like that, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I love you. I want us to have a family. You've been so focused on work lately. I thought maybe you just needed a push to see how wonderful it could be. The paternalistic tone in his voice, the way he spoke about my career as if it were a hobby I needed to outgrow, confirmed what I'd been slowly realizing over the past month. Derek didn't see me as an equal partner in our marriage. He saw me as a project to be managed, a vessel for his vision of our future, regardless of what I wanted for myself. A push, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. You call reproductive coercion a push? Don't use those words, he snapped, finally showing his true colors. You're making this sound like something criminal. We're husband and wife. Everything I do is for us, for our future. No, Derek. Everything you do is for you, for what you want, regardless of how I feel about it. I pulled the pregnancy test from my pocket and placed it on the counter between us. His eyes immediately locked onto it, and I watched a complex mix of emotions cross his face: triumph, guilt, excitement, fear. It was the triumph that made my decision for me. Despite being caught in his deception, despite my obvious distress, part of him was celebrating the success of his scheme. Congratulations, I said coldly. Your plan worked. I'm pregnant. Derek's face transformed, the mask of contrition disappearing entirely, replaced by a smugness that made my skin crawl. Chloe, that's wonderful. I know you're upset right now, but once you adjust to the idea, you'll see that this is the best thing that could have happened to us. The best thing? I stared at him in disbelief. Derek, you drugged me. You systematically violated my trust and my body for months. You took away my choice about one of the most important decisions a woman can make. I gave us a future, he countered, reaching for me. I stepped back, putting the kitchen island between us. You were so caught up in your career, in waiting for the perfect moment, that would never come. Sometimes someone has to make the hard decisions. Someone, Derek. This isn't some abstract decision about our finances, or where to go on vacation. This is my body, my life, my choice to make. He rolled his eyes in a gesture that was so dismissive, so utterly contemptuous of my autonomy, that something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't just about the pills or the pregnancy. This was about a pattern of control and manipulation that I'd been too trusting to see, too invested in our marriage to acknowledge. You're being hysterical, he said, using the word that he knew would infuriate me most. Pregnancy hormones can make women emotional. Once you calm down, You'll realize that this is exactly what we both wanted. The condescension in his voice was the final straw. Not only had he violated my reproductive autonomy, not only was he completely unrepentant about his deception, but now he was using my pregnancy, the pregnancy he'd forced on me through deception, to dismiss my legitimate anger as hormonal irrationality. What we both want. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Derek, you have no idea what I want. You've been so busy deciding what's best for me that you've never bothered to actually listen to what I've been trying to tell you. I listened to you, he protested, but even as he said it, his phone buzzed and he glanced down at it automatically, the way he always did, even during our most serious conversations. No, you don't. You hear the words you want to hear and filter out everything else. You've been doing it for years and I've been too accommodating to call you out on it. I thought about all the times I'd expressed concerns about his drinking, only to have him deflect with jokes about how I worried too much. All the times I'd tried to discuss my career goals, only to have him steer the conversation toward his vision of our domestic future. All the times I'd attempted to address problems in our marriage, only to be told I was overthinking things, or being too sensitive. That's not fair, Chloe. I've always supported your career. You've tolerated my career as long as it didn't interfere with your plans for me. The moment I started getting serious about the promotion, the moment it became clear that my success might require some sacrifices from you, you decided to sabotage my birth control to force me into a different role. Derek's face flushed with anger. That's not what happened. I didn't sabotage anything. I just accelerated our timeline. You accelerated our timeline, Derek. Listen to yourself. You're talking about my pregnancy like it's a project deadline you moved up without consulting your team. Don't twist my words, he said, his voice rising. I'm trying to explain that I did this because I love you, because I want us to have the family we've always talked about. The family you've always talked about. I correct. I've been clear about wanting to wait, about wanting to establish my career first, about wanting to be financially stable. But you decided my timeline didn't matter. I watched him struggle to find an argument that would justify his actions, could see him mentally cycling through the explanations and justifications he'd probably been preparing for months in case I discovered his deception. But there was no justification for what he'd done, and we both knew. So what now? He asked finally, his tone shifting to something that was supposed to sound reasonable but came across as calculating. Are you going to punish our child because you're angry at me? The manipulation in that question was breathtaking. He just admitted to systematically deceiving me for months, violating my reproductive autonomy, and dismissing my legitimate anger as hysteria, and now he was trying to frame any decision I made about the pregnancy as punishing an innocent child. I'm not punishing anyone, Derek. I'm trying to figure out how to move forward now that I know who I'm really married to. You're married to someone who loves you, he said, but the words sounded hollow, like a script he'd memorized rather than a truth he felt. No, Derek. I'm married to someone who thinks love gives him the right to make decisions about my body without my consent. I'm married to someone who thinks my autonomy is negotiable if it conflicts with his vision of our future. The conversation continued for another hour, but it was clear that Derek genuinely couldn't understand why I was so upset. To him, marriage meant that my individual agency was subordinate to his vision of our collective future. He saw my anger as an overreaction, my sense of betrayal as hormonal instability, my demands for autonomy as selfishness. As I lay in bed that night, Derek sleeping peacefully beside me as if nothing had changed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my body and my future, had been systematically undermining my reproductive choices for months. Worse, he felt justified in doing so and couldn't understand why I saw it as a violation. But as I lay there in the dark, a different kind of clarity began to emerge. Derek's deception had revealed something important, not just about him, but about our entire relationship. I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife, so invested in making our marriage work, that I'd been gradually surrendering pieces of myself without even realizing it. The birth control deception wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of years of subtle control and manipulation that I'd been too trusting or too invested to recognize. Derek didn't see me as an equal partner, he saw me as a supporting character in his life story, someone whose role was to facilitate his vision of success and happiness regardless of what I wanted for myself. As the hours passed, and Derek continued sleeping peacefully beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. If Derek thought he could manipulate me into the future he wanted, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. If he believed that marriage gave him the right to make decisions about my body and my life without my consent, I was going to show him exactly what it felt like to have someone else control the narrative. The pregnancy test sat on my nightstand, a small plastic reminder of how completely my life had been altered by someone else's choices. But as I stared at it in the dim light from the street lamp outside our window, I realized that Derek had made a critical error in his calculation. He'd assumed that getting me pregnant would trap me in his vision of our future, would force me to accept his control and manipulation as the price of family stability. What he didn't understand was that his deception had actually freed me from the illusion that our marriage was based on mutual respect and partnership. For the first time in years, I could see clearly how systematically he'd been undermining my autonomy, how gradually he'd been shaping our relationship to serve his needs, rather than our shared goals. Derek had started a game that he thought he'd already won, but he'd made the mistake of assuming that I would play by his rules, that I would accept his deception and manipulation as the natural order of our marriage. He was about to discover that he'd underestimated his opponent completely, and that the wife he thought he could control and manipulate had some moves of her own that he'd never seen coming. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. Derek had shown me exactly who he was and what he thought of my autonomy. Now it was time for me to show him what happened when someone tried to control and manipulate a woman who'd finally learned to recognize her own worth. The following week passed in a haze of carefully maintained normalcy. Derek went to work each morning with his usual confidence, kissing my forehead and reminding me to take my vitamins, the irony of which wasn't lost on me. I continued my routine at the marketing firm, sitting through client meetings and campaign reviews, while my mind churned with the implications of what I'd discovered. The pregnancy symptoms were becoming impossible to ignore. Morning sickness hit me like clockwork every day around 10 a.m., forcing me to excuse myself from meetings to vomit in the office bathroom. My colleague Jessica noticed my frequent absences and pale complexion, offering me crackers and ginger tea with the knowing look of someone who'd been through pregnancy herself. "You should see a doctor," she suggested during one of our coffee breaks, watching me push away the muffin I'd ordered, but couldn't stomach. "That stomach bug you've been fighting seems pretty persistent." I nodded non-committally, knowing I'd have to schedule an appointment soon. The reality of the pregnancy was settling in, and I needed medical confirmation beyond the home test. More importantly, I needed to understand my options and timeline. Derek had taken away my choice about becoming pregnant, but he couldn't control what happened now. At home, Derek had become insufferably attentive. He insisted on cooking dinner every night, claiming he wanted to make sure I was eating properly. He'd hover over me during meals, making comments about how important nutrition was for women our age, how we needed to start thinking about building healthy habits. The paternalistic tone in his voice made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to smile and thank him for his consideration. "You seem tired lately," he observed one evening as I pushed vegetables around my plate, fighting another wave of nausea. "Maybe you should consider cutting back on some of your projects at work. Stress isn't good for anyone." The suggestion was delivered with casual concern, but I could hear the underlying expectation. Derek was already positioning himself to suggest that my career was incompatible with optimal health, laying the groundwork for the argument that I should scale back my professional ambitions for my own well-being. "Just a busy period at the firm. The Henderson campaign is in its final phase." "The Henderson campaign," Derek repeated thoughtfully. "That's the retail chain expansion project, right? The one you've been staying late for all those I nodded, wondering where he was going with this line of questioning. "You know, sweetheart, I've been thinking about our 5-year plan lately. With my partnership track at the firm looking so promising, we might want to reconsider some of our priorities. Maybe this is a good time for you to think about transitioning to a more flexible role, something that would give you more time to focus on other aspects of life." He couldn't even say the word pregnancy out loud, couldn't acknowledge what he'd done, but he was already trying to manipulate me into restructuring my career around the consequences of his deception. "My career is important to me, Derek. You know that." "Of course it is," he said quickly, reaching across the table to pat my hand in that condescending way that had become his signature gesture. "I'm not suggesting you give up work entirely, just maybe consider whether climbing the corporate ladder is really the best use of your energy right now." I stared at him across our dining room table, surrounded by the expensive furniture and carefully curated decor that represented his vision of success, and felt a familiar rage building in my chest. Derek had systematically violated my reproductive autonomy, and now he was trying to use the consequences of his violation to reshape my professional life, according to his preferences. What if I don't want to reconsider my priorities? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked quietly. Derek's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself." That night, after Derek fell asleep with his usual post-wine contentment, I sat in our home office researching everything I could find about reproductive coercion. The term itself was new to me, but the behavior patterns described in article after article matched Derek's actions perfectly. The gradual isolation from support networks, the financial control disguised as helpfulness, the dismissal of my concerns and preferences, emotional overreactions. Reading about other women's experiences, I began to recognize patterns in my own marriage that I'd been too trusting to identify. Derek's insistence on managing our joint finances because he was better with numbers. His subtle discouragement of my friendships, particularly with women he deemed negative influences. His habit of making major decisions about our lives and presenting them to me as done deals that I could either accept gracefully or fight about uselessly. The birth control deception wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to control and manipulate me that had been building for years. Derek had been gradually training me to accept his authority over my choices, and the pregnancy was his attempt to make that control permanent and irreversible. But as I read story after story of women who'd escaped similar situations, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. These women had found ways to reclaim their autonomy, to rebuild their lives on their own terms. They discovered strength they didn't know they possessed, and created futures that honored their own dreams rather than serving someone else's vision. I started a private email account that Derek couldn't monitor and began reaching out to domestic violence resources. Not because Derek was physically abusive, but because I was beginning to understand that abuse took many forms. The counselor I spoke with over an encrypted chat confirmed what I'd been learning through my research. Reproductive coercion was a form of intimate partner violence, and Derek's behavior fit the pattern perfectly. The important thing to understand, the counselor explained during our first conversation, is that this isn't about the pregnancy itself. It's about power and control. He used deception to make a major life decision for you without your consent, and now he's trying to use the consequences of that deception to reshape your life according to his preferences. "I feel so stupid for not seeing it sooner," I admitted, typing the words while Derek watched television in the next room, oblivious to my growing awareness of his manipulation. "That's exactly how these situations are designed to work," she replied. "The control builds gradually, often disguised as love and protection. By the time you recognize what's happening, you've been conditioned to doubt your own perceptions and prioritize keeping the peace over asserting your boundary." The counselor helped me understand that my feelings of confusion and self-doubt were normal responses to sustained manipulation. Derek had been gradually undermining my confidence in my own judgment for years, making me more dependent on his interpretations of reality, and less likely to trust my own instincts when something felt wrong. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to the subtle ways Derek controlled our interactions, how he'd change the subject when I tried to discuss my work achievements, how he'd interrupt me when I was talking to redirect conversations toward topics he preferred, how he'd dismiss my opinions by attributing them to stress or hormones, particularly when I disagreed with his perspective on something important. The pregnancy gave me a unique opportunity to observe his behavior with new clarity. Derek was so confident that he'd achieved his goal of trapping me in his vision of our future, that he'd become careless about hiding his controlling tendencies. He'd started making assumptions about my choices that revealed just how little he actually knew about what I wanted from life. I was thinking we should start looking at houses with better school districts, he announced one evening, spreading real estate listings across our coffee table like he was presenting evidence in a legal case. The market is competitive, but with my promotion coming through, we should be able to afford something in Brookfield or maybe even Westchester. I looked at the listings he'd selected, all large suburban homes with manicured lawns and three-car garages, the kind of places where successful lawyers raised their families according to a very specific script. None of them looked like places where I could imagine myself living, but Derek had clearly spent considerable time researching them. When did you start looking at houses? I asked, noting that several of the listings had printed dates from weeks earlier. I've been keeping an eye on the market for a while now, he said casually. Real estate is all about timing, and I wanted to be prepared when we were ready to move. Ready to move, as if the decision to relocate our entire lives was something we'd discussed and agreed upon rather than something he'd been planning unilaterally, while systematically sabotaging my birth control to create the circumstances that would make his timeline seem reasonable. I like our townhouse, I said carefully, and my commute to the firm is perfect from here. Derek's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The townhouse was perfect for us as a couple, but we need to think about the future now. Good schools, safe neighborhoods, space for a family to grow. These are the kinds of decisions that successful people make proactively rather than reactively. The way he framed it, as a choice between being successful and proactive versus unsuccessful and reactive, was typical of his manipulation tactic. Derek had a gift for presenting his preferences as obvious conclusions that any reasonable person would reach, making disagreement seem irrational or short-sighted. What if I get the promotion I've been working toward? I asked. The Henderson campaign is generating serious buzz, and Sarah mentioned that the partnership track might be opening up sooner than expected. Derek's smile became strained. That's wonderful, sweetheart, but we need to be realistic about what's sustainable long-term. Partnership track positions require tremendous time commitments, and that might not be compatible with other priorities we'll have soon. Other priority. He still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge the pregnancy directly, but he was already using it to argue against my professional advancement. Derek had created the circumstances that would make my career more challenging, and now he was positioning himself as the voice of reason, suggesting that I accept those limitations rather than fight to overcome them. Maybe I want to fight for what I've been working toward instead of accepting limitations that someone else created, I said, watching his face carefully. Derek's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the frustration underneath his patient concern. Chloe, I'm trying to help you think through this logically. Sometimes being a good partner means making sacrifices for the greater good of the relationship. And what sacrifices are you planning to make, Derek? The question caught him off guard. In all his careful planning about our future, about the house we should buy, and the lifestyle we should adopt, he'd never considered what he might need to give up to accommodate the changes he'd forced on our lives. I'm working toward partnership specifically so I can provide for our family, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. My career stability will give you the freedom to make choices based on what's best for everyone, not just financial necessity. What's best for everyone? Derek had appointed himself the arbiter of what was best for everyone, including me, without ever asking what I thought would be best for my own life. He'd created a framework where his professional success was essential and non-negotiable, while my career was optional and potentially selfish depending on how it served his vision of our collective future. That weekend, Derek suggested we drive out to look at some of the houses he'd selected, framing it as a fun weekend activity rather than a serious house hunting expedition. I agreed, curious to see how far his planning had progressed and what his vision of our future actually looked like in concrete terms. The houses were exactly what I'd expected: large, expensive, and utterly soulless. Each one came with a three-car garage, a master suite with walk-in closets, and a kitchen designed more for entertaining Derek's colleagues than for actual cooking. The real estate agent, who clearly knew Derek already, launched into detailed explanations about property values and school ratings, while I wandered through rooms that felt like museum displays of suburban success. The location is perfect for commuting to downtown, the agent explained as we toured the third house of the day. 30 minutes by train, and the station has excellent parking facility. I noticed that she directed this information to Derek, not to me, despite the fact that I also worked downtown and would presumably need to commute as well. Derek nodded approvingly, as if the convenience of his commute was the primary consideration in choosing where we'd live. "What about commuting to the Meridian District?" I asked, referring to the area where my firm was located. "How long would that take?" The agent looked confused, glancing between Derek and me, as if unsure who she should address. "Well, that would be, probably an hour each way, maybe longer depending on traffic." An hour each way. Derek had been planning to move us to a location that would add 2 hours to my daily commute, making it significantly more difficult for me to maintain my current level of professional commitment. When I looked at him questioningly, he just shrugged. "I assumed you'd be transitioning to a more flexible arrangement soon anyway," he said casually. "Maybe freelance consulting or part-time work, something that would give you more control over your schedule." He'd assumed Derek had been making plans that would fundamentally alter my professional life, and he'd simply assumed that I would be willing to accept a more limited role to accommodate the changes he'd decided were necessary. The pregnancy he'd forced on me through deception was already being used to justify restructuring my entire career according to his preferences. Driving home that evening, I felt a clarity settling over me that was both terrifying and liberating. Derek wasn't planning a future with me. He was planning a future for me, one where my role was to facilitate his vision of success and family stability regardless of what I wanted for my own life. The house hunting expedition had revealed the extent to which he'd been making unilateral decisions about our future while maintaining the illusion that we were partners in planning our lives together. "So what did you think?" Derek asked as we pulled into our drive. "I know it's a big change, but I think you could really be happy in a place like that." "You could be happy. Not we could be happy. Not this would be good for both of us, but you could be happy with the life I've planned for you." Derek's language revealed everything about how he viewed our relationship and my role in his vision of our future. "I think we have very different ideas about what would make me happy," I replied quietly. Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Chloe, I know change is scary, but sometimes we have to trust that the people who love us know what's best for us, even when we can't see it ourselves. The people who love us know what's best for us." Derek had just articulated his fundamental belief about our marriage, that his love for me gave him the authority to override my own judgment about what was best for my life. He'd convinced himself that deceiving me about my birth control was an act of love, that planning a future I'd never agreed to was an expression of care and commitment. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who believed he knew what was best for me better than I knew myself, I made a decision that would change everything. Derek had started a game of manipulation and control, confident that he held all the advantages. He'd systematically undermined my reproductive autonomy, dismissed my career ambitions as optional obstacles to his vision of our future, and appointed himself the decision-maker for our family's direction. What Derek didn't understand was that his deception had actually freed me from the illusion that our marriage was based on mutual respect and partnership. For the first time in years, I could see clearly how systematically he'd been undermining my autonomy, how completely he'd been reshaping our relationship to serve his needs, rather than our shared goal. Derek thought he'd won by getting me pregnant, thought he'd successfully trapped me in his vision of our future. But he'd made a critical error in his calculation. He'd assumed that I would accept his control and manipulation as the price of family stability, that I would be grateful for his management of my life and choices. Instead, his deception had shown me exactly what kind of man I was really married to, and exactly what kind of future awaited me if I continued to accept his authority over my choices. Derek had revealed his true nature through his actions, and now it was time for me to reveal mine through my response. The pregnancy test still sat in my dresser drawer, a small plastic reminder of how completely Derek had violated my trust and autonomy. But as I lay there in the dark listening to him sleep peacefully beside me, I realized that he'd also given me something valuable: absolute clarity about who he really was and what our marriage had actually become. Derek had taught me that he viewed my consent as optional if it conflicted with his timeline. He'd shown me that he believed love gave him the right to make decisions about my body without my knowledge or agreement. He demonstrated that he saw my career and ambitions as negotiable obstacles to his vision of our collective success. Now it was time for me to teach Derek what happened when someone tried to control and manipulate a woman who'd finally learned to recognize her own worth. He'd started this game believing he held all the advantages, but he was about to discover that he'd underestimated his opponent completely. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. Derek had shown me exactly who he was and what he thought of my autonomy. Now it was time for me to show him what happened when someone pushed the wrong woman too far. As Derek went through his morning routine, checking his phone and straightening his tie, I watched him with new eyes. He had no idea that his wife had evolved beyond the compliant partner he'd been systematically conditioning me to become. He couldn't imagine that the woman he'd been manipulating and controlling was capable of strategic thinking that matched his own. Derek had started a war for control of my life, my body, and my future. He'd fired the first shots with deception and reproductive coercion, confident that his tactical advantages would guarantee his victory. But wars aren't won by the side that strikes first. They're won by the side that adapts, learns, and ultimately outmaneuvers their opponent. Derek was about to learn that lesson the hard way. My transformation began with something as simple as a library card. 3 weeks after discovering Derek's deception, I walked into the Denver Public Library during my lunch break and applied for a library card using my maiden name, something I hadn't used since our wedding 5 years ago. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, smiled as she handed me the small plastic card that felt like a key to a world Derek couldn't monitor or control. "Welcome back to reading, Chloe Martinez," she said, and hearing my original name spoken aloud after years of being Derek's wife felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. I checked out books on financial independence, legal rights in marriage, and starting over after betrayal. Each evening while Derek worked late at his law firm or attended his networking events, I absorbed information that would have been impossible to research on our shared computer at home. The library became my sanctuary, a place where I could think clearly without Derek's constant presence, reshaping my thoughts and priorities. The pregnancy was progressing exactly as Derek had planned, but instead of feeling trapped by it, I began to see it as motivation. Every wave of morning sickness reminded me that someone had made this choice for me without my consent. Every prenatal appointment I scheduled became an opportunity to ask questions about my options and timeline. Every conversation with my doctor reinforced that this pregnancy, regardless of how it had been conceived, was ultimately my decision to continue or terminate. Dr. Sarah Chen had been my gynecologist for 3 years, and when I told her about Derek's deception during a routine appointment, her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "What you're describing is reproductive coercion," she said, her voice professional but warm. "It's a form of intimate partner violence, and it's never acceptable, regardless of marital status." She provided me with resources for counseling and legal support, and more importantly, she assured me that whatever decision I made about the pregnancy would be respected and supported by her medical team. For the first time since discovering the switched pills, I felt like I had an ally who understood the gravity of what Derek had done. "Take your time making decisions," Dr. Chen advised. "This is your body and your choice, regardless of how the pregnancy occurred. Don't let anyone pressure you into choices that don't align with your values and goals." Armed with this medical support and the knowledge I was gaining through my research, I began making small changes that Derek didn't notice, but that gave me increasing confidence in my ability to control my own narrative. I opened a savings account at a different bank using my maiden name, transferring small amounts from our joint account that Derek wouldn't miss, but that would accumulate into meaningful independence over time. I reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, reaching out through social media to rebuild the support network that Derek had gradually encouraged me to abandon. My friend Rachel, who lived in Portland and worked as a therapist, became particularly important during this period. She understood the dynamics of controlling relationships and helped me recognize patterns in Derek's behavior that I'd been normalizing for years. The thing about gradual control, Rachel explained during one of our long phone conversations, is that it feels like love and protection until you're far enough away to see the pattern. Each individual incident seems reasonable, but the cumulative effect is that you lose agency over your own life. Through these conversations, I began to understand that Derek's control extended far beyond the birth control deception. He'd been systematically isolating me from friends, managing our finances in ways that made me dependent on his income, and shaping our social calendar to prioritize his professional relationships over my personal connection. The pregnancy was just the culmination of a longer campaign to reshape my life according to his vision. At work, I threw myself into the Henderson campaign with renewed focus. If Derek expected me to scale back my professional ambitions because of the pregnancy he'd forced on me, I was determined to prove him wrong. I stayed late analyzing market data, developed innovative marketing strategies that impressed our clients, and positioned myself as indispensable to the campaign's success. My colleague Jessica noticed the change in my work intensity and approached me after a particularly successful client presentation. "I don't know what's motivated you lately, but whatever it is, keep it up," she said with a grin. "That presentation was brilliant. Sarah's definitely taking notice." Sarah Kellerman, the managing partner at our firm, had indeed been paying attention to my work. She called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon to discuss my future with the company. "Chloe, I'll be direct," Sarah said, settling behind her impressive desk. "Your work on Henderson has been exceptional. The client is thrilled, and frankly, so am I. I'm considering fast-tracking your promotion to senior account manager, which would come with a significant salary increase and equity stake in the firm." The opportunity was everything I'd been working toward for the past 3 years, but Sarah's next words made it even more meaningful. "I should mention that this position would require some travel and longer hours initially, but it would also give you the flexibility to build your own team and set your own schedule within reason. I believe in supporting working mothers, and I want to make sure you know that pregnancy won't negatively impact your advancement here." Sarah knew about the pregnancy because I'd had to disclose it for health insurance purposes, but her assumption that I would continue working challenged Derek's narrative that career success was incompatible with family responsibility. Here was a successful woman offering me exactly the kind of professional future that Derek had been subtly discouraging me from pursuing. "I'm very interested," I told Sarah, and meant it completely. "Excellent. I'll need a formal answer by next week, but I wanted to give you time to discuss it with your husband and make sure you're both comfortable with the commitment." Discuss it with your husband. Even Sarah, a successful professional woman, assumed that major career decisions required spousal approval. The phrase reminded me how thoroughly society reinforced the idea that married women's choices should be subject to their husband's veto power, even when those husbands had proven themselves untrustworthy with such authority. That evening, I decided to test Derek's reaction to my potential promotion. I brought it up casually over dinner, watching his face carefully as I described Sarah's offer. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Derek said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah clearly recognizes your talent. Although I have to say, the timing is interesting." "What do you mean?" "Well, with everything we have going on in our personal lives, it might be worth considering whether this is the right moment to take on additional professional responsibility." Everything we have going on in our personal lives. Derek's euphemistic reference to the pregnancy he'd forced on me through deception was typical of his manipulation tactic. He couldn't acknowledge what he'd done directly, but he was already using the consequences of his actions to argue against my professional advancement. "The promotion comes with flexibility," I pointed out. Sarah specifically mentioned supporting working mothers. Derek's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, and that's admirable, but corporate flexibility and actual work-life balance aren't always the same thing. You know how demanding these senior positions can be. You don't think I can handle it?" "I think you're incredibly capable," Derek said carefully. "I just want to make sure you're considering all the factors. My partnership track is really heating up right now, and it would be easier for me to focus on that if I knew you weren't overwhelmed with new responsibilities." There it was. Derek's real concern wasn't my well-being or ability to handle the promotion, it was how my professional success might interfere with his own career advancement. He needed me to be available to support his ambitions, and my promotion represented a threat to that arrangement. What if I want to focus on my own career advancement for a while? I asked quietly. Derek's mask slipped completely for a moment, revealing genuine anger before he recovered his composure. Chloe, we're a team. Sometimes being a good teammate means making strategic decisions about timing and priorities. And who decides what constitutes good strategy for the team? We decide together, Derek said, but his tone suggested that he viewed himself as the senior partner in any such decision-making process. I nodded as if I agreed with his perspective, but internally I was cataloging another example of Derek's expectation that my choices should serve his vision of our collective future. The promotion represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Derek believed I should decline in service of what he deemed our greater good. Over the following days, I made my decision about the promotion without consulting Derek further. I accepted Sarah's offer and signed the paperwork during my lunch break, using my maiden name for the employment contract and setting up direct deposit into my private savings account. Derek would learn about my decision when I was ready to tell him, not when he expected to be consulted about it. The promotion required me to work later hours and attend more client dinners, which gave me additional freedom to continue my research and planning. While Derek assumed I was building the marketing campaigns that would benefit our clients, I was actually building the foundation for my own independence. I consulted with a divorce attorney named Michael Torres, who specialized in cases involving financial control and reproductive coercion. Michael was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, but his understanding of the legal implications of Derek's behavior was sophisticated and reassuring. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, Michael explained during our initial consultation, which means we don't need to prove wrongdoing to dissolve the marriage. However, the reproductive coercion you've described could be relevant for other aspects of the proceeding. Michael helped me understand my legal rights regarding property division, spousal support, and most importantly, my options regarding the pregnancy. He connected me with counselors who specialized in helping women make informed decisions about pregnancies that had resulted from reproductive coercion. The key thing to remember, Michael emphasized, is that you have more power in this situation than you might realize. Derek's behavior has been controlling and manipulative, but you're not trapped. You have resources, education, professional skills, and legal rights that protect your ability to make independent choices about your future. Through these consultations, I learned that Derek's financial control wasn't as absolute as he'd led me to believe. Colorado's marital property laws meant that I had legitimate claims to assets I'd helped build during our marriage, including equity in our townhouse and Derek's retirement accounts. The salary increase from my promotion would also strengthen my position significantly. I began documenting Derek's controlling behavior systematically, keeping detailed records of his attempts to manipulate my career decisions, his unilateral planning for our future, and his dismissive responses to my concerns and preferences. Michael had advised me that while Colorado didn't require proof of misconduct for divorce, having clear documentation of Derek's pattern of control could be useful for other legal purposes. The documentation process was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Writing down specific examples of Derek's manipulation forced me to confront how extensively he'd been controlling my choices and how gradually I'd been conditioned to accept his authority over my life. Incidents that had seemed like minor disagreements at the time revealed themselves as part of a systematic campaign to undermine my independence. My friend Rachel helped me recognize the psychological aspects of what Derek had been doing through our regular phone conversation. As a therapist, she understood the techniques that controlling partners use to maintain their dominance in relationship. Reproductive coercion is particularly insidious, Rachel explained, because it attacks a woman's sense of bodily autonomy, while simultaneously creating circumstances that make it harder for her to leave the relationship. The pregnancy becomes both a symbol of the violation and a practical barrier to independence. Through therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in reproductive coercion, I began to understand that my feelings of confusion and self-doubt were normal responses to sustained manipulation. Derek had been gradually undermining my confidence in my own judgment for years, making me more dependent on his interpretations of reality and less likely to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Recovery from this kind of manipulation, my counselor explained, involves rebuilding your trust in your own perceptions and decisions. Derek trained you to doubt yourself and defer to his judgment. Healing means learning to trust yourself again. The counseling sessions were challenging but transformative. I began to recognize how many of my thoughts and preferences had been shaped by Derek's subtle influence rather than my own authentic desire. The process of rediscovering my own voice, separate from Derek's constant input and correction, was both liberating and sometimes overwhelming. At work, my promotion was generating exactly the kind of success that Derek had predicted would be unsustainable. The Henderson campaign exceeded all performance metrics, leading to contract renewals and referrals that significantly boosted the firm's revenue. Sarah took me to lunch to celebrate and discuss my future trajectory within the company. "I'll be honest, Chloe," Sarah said over salads at an upscale downtown restaurant. "When I offered you this promotion, I expected good results, but you've exceeded every expectation. The clients love working with you, your team respects your leadership, and your strategic thinking has impressed everyone." She paused to take a sip of her wine before continuing with a smile that suggested she had more good news to share. "I'm prepared to offer you a partnership track position, which would make you the youngest partner in the firm's history. The compensation package would include a significant equity stake and profit-sharing arrangement that would provide long-term financial security." Partnership. The opportunity represented everything I'd dreamed of professionally, but it also represented something more important: proof that Derek's narrative about my capabilities and limitations was completely wrong. Here was concrete evidence that I could excel at the highest levels of professional achievement, that pregnancy didn't disqualify me from serious career advancement, and that other successful women were eager to support my ambitions rather than discourage them. "There would be significant responsibilities," Sarah continued, "including client development, team management, and strategic planning for the firm's growth. But there would also be autonomy to shape your role according to your strengths and interests." Autonomy. The word felt foreign after years of marriage to someone who believed he knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. The idea of having control over my professional decisions, of being trusted to shape my own role based on my judgment, rather than someone else's vision of what I should want, was intoxicating. "I'm very interested," I told Sarah, and realized that I meant it with every fiber of my being. "Excellent. Take some time to think it over and discuss it with your family. This is a big decision that will affect your entire future. Discuss it with your family." Sarah's assumption that Derek should have input into my career decisions reminded me how completely I'd internalized the idea that married women's professional choices required spousal approval. But Derek had forfeited any right to influence my decisions when he'd chosen to violate my reproductive autonomy. His deception had freed me from any obligation to prioritize his preferences over my own ambition. That evening, Derek noticed my improved mood and energy level, attributing it to what he assumed was my growing acceptance of the pregnancy and the domestic future he'd planned for us. "You seem happier lately," he observed over dinner. "I'm glad you're starting to adjust to all the changes ahead of us." All the changes ahead of. Derek still couldn't acknowledge the pregnancy directly or admit what he'd done to cause it, but he was already interpreting my increased confidence as evidence that his manipulation was working exactly as intended. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," I agreed, which was absolutely true, though not in the way Derek imagined. "I'm proud of how you're handling everything," Derek continued, reaching across the table to pat my hand in his characteristic condescending gesture. "I know this wasn't exactly how we planned to start our family, but sometimes the best things in life happen when we're not expecting them. The best things in life happen when we're not expecting them." Derek's reframing of his systematic deception as a happy accident was breathtaking in its audacity. He'd convinced himself that violating my reproductive autonomy was actually a gift that I would eventually learn to appreciate, once I'd adjusted my perspective to match his vision of what was best for our family. "Speaking of the future," Derek said, pulling out his phone to show me something that made my stomach drop, "I put an offer on the house in Brookfield, the one with the great school district we looked at last weekend." He'd put an offer on a house without consulting me, without discussing our timeline or budget, without acknowledging that such a decision might require input from both partners in the marriage. Derek had unilaterally committed us to a major financial and lifestyle change based on his assumption that I would accept whatever decisions he made about our future. "You put an offer on a house," I repeated slowly, trying to process the magnitude of his presumption. "I had to move quickly," Derek explained, as if his urgency justified making such a decision without my consent. "The market is competitive, and I didn't want to lose the opportunity. But don't worry, I made it contingent on your approval, so we can still back out if you have concern." "Contingent on your approval." Derek had presented his unilateral decision as considerate, because he'd built in an escape clause that would allow me to veto his choice. He'd positioned himself as decisive and proactive while giving me the illusion of input, through the power to reject what he'd already decided was best for us. "What if I said I didn't want to move to Brookfield?" I asked quietly. Derek's expression shifted to the patient condescension he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Then we'd discuss it, of course. But I think once you really consider the benefits, the schools, the community, the investment potential, you'll see that this is the right move for our family. You'll see that this is the right move." Derek was so confident in his ability to convince me to accept his decisions that he'd already committed us financially to the outcome he preferred. He'd eliminated my actual choice while maintaining the pretense that my opinion mattered in the decision-making process. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who'd just committed us to a major life change without my consent, I felt the last vestiges of uncertainty about my course of action disappear completely. Derek had shown me exactly who he was, and what our marriage would become if I continued to accept his authority over my choices. He'd violated my reproductive autonomy, planned a future I'd never agreed to, and now committed us to major financial obligations based on his unilateral decision about where we should live. Each action revealed his fundamental belief that marriage gave him the right to override my preferences when they conflicted with his vision of our collective good. But Derek had made a critical error in his calculation. He'd assumed that I would continue to be the compliant partner he'd been conditioning me to become, that I would accept his control and manipulation as the price of family stability. He'd underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking and my willingness to fight for my own autonomy. Derek had taught me that he viewed my consent as optional when it conflicted with his timeline. He'd demonstrated that he believed love gave him the right to make decisions about my body and my future without my knowledge or agreement. He'd shown me that he saw my career and ambitions as obstacles to his vision of our collective success. Now it was time for me to teach Derek what happened when someone pushed a woman who'd finally learned to recognize her own worth and was prepared to fight for it. The partnership papers arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in an elegant envelope bearing the firm's embossed letterhead. As I read through the contract terms, I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with the impressive salary figures or equity percentages, and everything to do with the recognition that I was capable of achieving success on my own merits, regardless of Derek's attempts to limit my ambition. Sarah had included a handwritten note with the contract explaining that the partnership would be announced at the firm's annual gala next month, giving me time to prepare for the increased responsibilities and public recognition that would come with the position. The timing was perfect in ways that Sarah couldn't have anticipated. By the time Derek learned about my promotion, I would already be established in a role that made me financially independent and professionally unassailable. I signed the partnership agreement during my lunch break using my maiden name as I had with all my recent legal documents. Chloe Martinez would be the name on the partnership announcement, the name on my business cards, and the name that clients would know me by. Derek's wife was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by a woman who belonged entirely to herself. The financial independence that came with the partnership was transformative in ways beyond the obvious. For the first time in our marriage, I had access to resources that Derek couldn't monitor or control. My private savings account had grown substantial enough to cover first and last month's rent on my own apartment, and the partnership equity would provide long-term security that didn't depend on anyone else's career success or financial management. Michael Torres had been helping me understand the legal implications of my newfound financial independence, particularly as it related to Colorado's marital property law. During our third consultation, he laid out a strategy that would protect my interests while minimizing Derek's ability to retaliate through legal or financial manipulation. The key is establishing clear separation of your professional achievements from any claims Derek might make about marital assets, Michael explained, spreading documents across his conference table. Your partnership equity will be considered separate properties since it's based on your individual professional merit, not marital contributions. He showed me how to structure my finances to maintain legal protection while building toward complete independence. The consulting work I'd been doing on weekends, the freelance projects I'd taken on during my commute, even the small investments I'd made with my private account, all of it contributed to establishing my financial autonomy. Derek's behavior has actually strengthened your legal position significantly, Michael continued. Reproductive coercion demonstrates a pattern of control that courts take seriously, especially when it comes to decisions about spousal support and property division. The documentation I'd been keeping of Derek's manipulative behavior had grown into a comprehensive record that painted a clear picture of systematic control and emotional abuse. Every attempt to undermine my career decisions, every dismissive response to my concerns, every unilateral choice he'd made about our future, all of it was carefully catalogued with dates, witnesses when available, and contemporaneous notes about my emotional state. Chin had been particularly helpful in documenting the medical aspects of Derek's reproductive coercion, providing detailed records of our conversations about the switched birth control pills and their impact on my physical and emotional well-being. Her notes would serve as crucial evidence if Derek tried to challenge any of my decisions about the pregnancy or claim that I was acting irrationally due to hormonal changes. The pregnancy itself had become a source of clarity rather than confusion as I worked with counselors who specialized in reproductive choice after coercion. Through these sessions, I came to understand that whatever decision I made about continuing or terminating the pregnancy needed to be mine alone, free from Derek's manipulation or anyone else's expectations about what a good woman should choose. The most important thing, my counselor emphasized during one particularly emotional session, is that you make this decision based on your own values and goals, not as a reaction to Derek's violation or an attempt to punish him for what he did. I spent weeks considering my options, talking with medical professionals about the practical implications of each choice, and examining my own feelings about motherhood separate from the circumstances that had created this pregnancy. The process was painful but necessary. Derek had stolen my choice about becoming pregnant, but he couldn't steal my choice about what happened next. Ultimately, I decided to continue the pregnancy, but on my terms and according to my timeline. The baby would be raised by a mother who'd fought for her independence and won, not by a woman who'd accepted her partner's control as the price of family stability. Derek's attempt to trap me through reproductive coercion had instead motivated me to become the kind of woman who could provide a child with a strong example of autonomy and self-determination. My decision to continue the pregnancy required careful strategic planning about timing and disclosure. Derek assumed that my apparent acceptance of his house offer and my general improved mood meant that I was settling into the domestic role he'd envisioned for me. He had no idea that I was actually preparing to restructure our entire relationship according to my preferences, rather than his. The house in Brookfield became a useful test of Derek's assumptions about my compliance. I allowed him to proceed with the purchasing process while secretly consulting with real estate attorneys about my options for withdrawing from the contract or protecting my interests if the sale went through. Derek's eagerness to commit us to a major financial obligation without my genuine consent provided additional documentation of his controlling behavior. "You're going to love it there," Derek said repeatedly as we dealt with inspections and paperwork, speaking as if my enthusiasm was a foregone conclusion rather than something he needed to earn through genuine consideration of my preference. The house represented everything problematic about Derek's vision of our future, isolated from my professional network, designed around his commute rather than mine, selected according to his priorities without meaningful input from me. Every conversation about decorating or landscaping revealed his assumption that I would naturally adapt my preferences to suit the life he'd chosen for us. But I played along with his planning, asking questions about school districts and neighborhood amenities while privately consulting with my attorney about exit strategies and financial protection. Derek's confidence in his control over my choices made him careless about hiding his manipulative tactics, providing me with increasingly clear evidence of his systematic disregard for my autonomy. The firm's annual gala provided the perfect opportunity to reveal the extent of my professional success to Derek and our social circle simultaneously. The event was always well attended by Denver's legal and business community, including many of Derek's colleagues and clients. When Sarah announced my partnership during her speech that evening, Derek would learn about my promotion at the same time as everyone else we knew professionally. I bought a new dress for the occasion, something elegant but powerful that reflected my new status as a partner rather than someone's wife attending a work function. The deep blue silk made me feel confident and authoritative, qualities that I'd been developing over the months of preparation but had rarely displayed so publicly. Derek noticed my attention to appearance and attributed it to what he assumed was my growing comfort with our changing circumstances. "You look beautiful," he said as we prepared to leave for the gala. "Pregnancy agrees with you. Pregnancy agrees with you." Derek's comment revealed his satisfaction with the physical evidence of his reproductive coercion, his pleasure in seeing the visible results of his deception and control. He had no idea that the confidence he was observing had nothing to do with accepting his manipulation and everything to do with preparing to reject it completely. The gala was held at the Denver Art Museum with cocktails in the sculpture garden followed by dinner and speeches in the main hall. Derek worked the room with his usual confidence, introducing me to potential clients and networking contacts with the casual possessiveness that had once made me feel cherished but now made my skin crawl. "This is my wife, Chloe," he would say, emphasizing the possessive pronoun in a way that defined me entirely through my relationship to him rather than acknowledging any independent identity or accomplishment. Sarah found me during the cocktail hour, pulling me aside to discuss the logistics of the partnership announcement and my transition into the new role. Her excitement about my promotion was genuine and infectious, a stark contrast to Derek's patronizing pride in what he saw as my adjustment to his vision of our future. "I can't wait to see everyone's reaction," Sarah said with a conspiratorial smile. "You've earned this completely, and I want to make sure everyone understands the significance of your achievements." As dinner was served and the formal program began, I felt a nervous energy building in my chest. Derek sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand in what he probably thought was supportive but felt possessive and controlling. He had no idea that the evening would fundamentally alter his understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Sarah's speech began with general remarks about the firm's successful year and gratitude to the team members who'd contributed to their growth. Derek listened politely, checking his phone occasionally and making quiet comments about business developments that he thought might interest me. His casual dismissal of the program revealed his assumption that my role at the event was primarily social rather than professional. "This year has been particularly exciting because we've had the opportunity to promote exceptional talent from within our organization," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the elegant dining room. "It's always gratifying to see team members grow into leadership roles and take ownership of their professional destinies." Derek nodded approvingly, probably thinking about his own career advancement and the partnership track he'd been pursuing at his law firm. He had no reason to suspect that Sarah's comments had any particular relevance to me, since he'd never taken my professional achievements seriously enough to consider that they might merit public recognition. "Tonight, I'm thrilled to announce the promotion of one of our most talented and dedicated team members to full partnership in the firm," Sarah said, pausing dramatically as the room fell silent with anticipation. Derek straightened in his chair, probably wondering which of my colleagues had earned the promotion and how their success might affect the firm's relationship with his legal practice. His expression was politely interested but not personally invested, the look of someone attending his wife's work function rather than witnessing a moment that would reshape his understanding of their marriage completely. "Please join me in congratulating our newest partner, Chloe Martinez," Sarah announced, her voice ringing with pride and authority. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, but it seemed to come from very far away as I watched Derek's face cycle through confusion, shock, and finally something that looked like panic. His mouth opened and closed without sound as he processed the implications of what he'd just heard, Not just that I'd been promoted to partner without consulting him, but that I'd done so using my maiden name. I stood to acknowledge the applause, feeling every eye in the room focused on me with respect and congratulations, rather than the polite attention usually paid to spouses at professional events. For the first time in years, I was being recognized for my own achievements rather than my relationship to Derek, and the feeling was intoxicating. Chloe has demonstrated exceptional leadership on our most challenging accounts, Sarah continued as I remained standing, particularly her innovative work on the Henderson campaign, which exceeded all performance metrics and established new benchmarks for client satisfaction. Derek's face had gone pale as he realized that my professional success had been building for months without his knowledge or input. The promotion he'd assumed I would decline or defer was not only a reality but an accomplished fact that had been achieved through my own merit and determination. As I sat back down, Derek leaned close to my ear, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We need to talk about this immediately." His demand for an immediate private conversation revealed everything about his approach to our marriage. Derek couldn't congratulate me publicly, or express pride in my achievement, because he was too focused on the threat that my success posed to his control over our relationship. His first instinct was to reassert his authority through demands for explanation and justification. "Of course," I replied calmly, placing my hand over his in a gesture that probably looked affectionate to observers, but was actually a warning about maintaining appearances in public. After the program, the rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations from colleagues and clients who were genuinely excited about my promotion. Several people mentioned that they'd been following my work on various campaigns and were impressed by my strategic thinking and leadership ability. Their recognition felt like validation of everything I'd been working toward, proof that Derek's dismissive attitude toward my career had been wrong in every possible way. Derek maintained his composure throughout the remainder of the event, smiling and accepting congratulations on my behalf with what probably looked like pride to casual observers, but I could feel his tension increasing as the evening progressed, could see him mentally preparing for the confrontation he clearly intended to initiate. As soon as we were alone, during the drive home, Derek's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. "How long have you been planning?" he asked, his voice cold with accusation. "Planning what? Working hard and earning recognition for my achievements? Don't play games with me, Chloe. You know exactly what I mean. The promotion, using your maiden name, making major career decisions without discussing them with me first. Making major career decisions without discussing them with me first." Derek's outrage at my professional autonomy was remarkable, coming from someone who'd been making unilateral decisions about our future for months, including reproductive choices that affected my body directly. "When did you discuss your decision to put an offer on the Brookfield house with me?" I asked quietly. "That's completely different," Derek snapped. "I was making a strategic decision for our family's future. You're making selfish choices that affect both of us without any consideration for how they impact our plans." Derek still couldn't acknowledge that his vision of our future had never been collaboratively developed, that he'd been making assumptions about my preferences and goals without ever genuinely consulting me about what I wanted from life. "What if my plans are different from yours, Derek?" The question hung in the air between us. As we pulled into our driveway, Derek turned off the engine but made no move to get out of the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared straight ahead. "We're married, Chloe. We don't get to have completely separate plans. Everything we do affects both of us, and major decisions require discussion and compromise, like the decision to switch my birth control pills with prenatal vitamins." Derek's entire body went rigid at my direct reference to his reproductive coercion. For weeks, we'd been dancing around the topic, discussing the pregnancy and its implications without explicitly acknowledging how it had been caused. But now, with my professional independence established and my legal preparations complete, I had no reason to continue protecting Derek from the consequences of his actions. "We've already discussed that," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, Derek." You attempted to justify it, and I was too shocked to respond appropriately. "But we've never actually discussed what it means that you violated my reproductive autonomy for months while lying to me about it every single day." "I didn't lie," Derek protested weakly. "I just made a decision that I thought was best for both of us. You made a decision about my body without my consent. You systematically deceived me about my own medication. You violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible, and then expected me to be grateful for the result. Derek finally turned to look at me, and I could see desperation beginning to replace anger in his expression. Chloe, I love you. Everything I did was because I love you, and want us to have the family we've always talked about. The family you've always talked about. I corrected. I was very clear about wanting to wait, about wanting to establish my career first, about wanting to make informed choices about timing and circumstances. And now you have established your career, Derek said, grasping for some way to frame my success as validation of his timeline rather than evidence of my independence. The partnership proves that you can balance professional achievement with family responsibility. The partnership proves that you can balance professional achievement with family responsibilities. Derek was already trying to rewrite the narrative, to claim that my success validated his decisions rather than contradicted his assumptions about my capabilities and limitations. The partnership proves that I can achieve success despite your attempts to limit my ambitions. I replied. It proves that other people recognize my value and potential, even when my own husband dismisses them. I've never dismissed your potential, Derek protested, but his voice carried no conviction. You've spent months suggesting that I should scale back my career goals because of a pregnancy you forced on me through deception. You've made unilateral decisions about where we should live, based on your commute, rather than mine. You've planned our entire future according to your preferences while dismissing my concerns as emotional overreaction. Derek stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find an argument that would restore his sense of control over the situation. Finally, he played the card I'd been expecting since the beginning of our confrontation. What about the baby, Chloe? Are you really going to destroy our child's family because you're angry about timing and communication issues? Timing and communication issues. Derek's minimization of reproductive coercion as a mere disagreement about scheduling and discussion protocols was breathtaking in its dishonesty. He was already trying to reframe his systematic violation of my autonomy as a minor marital dispute that I was overreacting to because of pregnancy hormones. I'm not destroying anything, Derek. I'm making informed choices about my future based on what I've learned about your character and your attitude toward my autonomy. My attitude toward your autonomy? Derek's voice rose with genuine confusion, as if the concept of my independent decision-making authority was foreign to him. Chloe, we're married. Your autonomy and my autonomy are interconnected. We make decisions together. When have we ever made decisions together, Derek? Really together, with equal input and genuine consideration of both perspectives. The question silenced him completely, probably because he couldn't think of a single example of truly collaborative decision-making in our marriage. Every major choice had been shaped by his preferences and justified through his reasoning, with my role being to accept his conclusions or be branded as unreasonable. As we sat in our driveway, the tension between us thick enough to cut, I realized that this conversation represented the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Derek had finally revealed the full extent of his expectations about our marriage, and I had finally found the courage to reject those expectations completely. Derek thought he'd won by getting me pregnant, thought he'd successfully trapped me in his vision of our future. But he'd made a critical error in his calculation. He'd assumed that I would continue to be the compliant partner he'd been conditioning me to become, that I would accept his control and manipulation as the price of family stability. Instead, his deception had freed me from the illusion that our marriage was based on mutual respect and partnership. Derek had taught me exactly who he was and what he thought of my autonomy, and now I was ready to teach him what happened when someone underestimated a woman who'd finally learned to recognize her own worth. The partnership announcement had been the first public declaration of my independence. Tomorrow Derek would learn about the rest of my preparations and discover that the wife he thought he could control and manipulate had become someone entirely different. Someone who belonged completely to herself and was prepared to fight for that freedom. The DNA test results arrived on a Wednesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Derek had submitted his sample to the testing company. He'd been so confident in his genetic connection to the baby that he'd never questioned why I'd suddenly become supportive of his desire for early paternity confirmation. Derek had interpreted my suggestion that we both get tested as evidence of my growing acceptance of our future together, never suspecting that I had my own reasons for wanting scientific documentation of the pregnancy's origin. Derek was in the shower when I signed for the certified envelope, and I took the opportunity to open his results before he had a chance to see them himself. The official letterhead and clinical language couldn't disguise the devastating simplicity of the conclusion. Derek Patterson was excluded as the biological father with 99.7% certainty. The baby I was carrying was not his child. The irony was perfect in ways that Derek couldn't possibly comprehend. While he'd been systematically deceiving me about my birth control pills, I'd been conducting my own form of reproductive strategy. The business trips I'd taken for client meetings, the networking events I'd attended without him, the late nights I'd spent allegedly working on campaigns. Derek had never questioned any of it, because he'd been so focused on his own manipulation that he'd missed mine entirely. James Rivera, the environmental consultant I'd met during the Henderson campaign, had been everything Derek wasn't: respectful, genuine, and completely transparent about his intention. Our connection had developed naturally over months of professional collaboration, built on mutual respect and intellectual attraction rather than control and possession. When Derek started his birth control deception, I'd already been involved with someone who treated me as an equal partner rather than a project to be managed. The timing had worked perfectly. Derek switched pills had prevented any pregnancy from our increasingly infrequent intimacy, while my relationship with James had flourished during the exact window when conception had actually occurred. Derek had been so pleased with his apparent success in getting me pregnant that he'd never questioned the timeline or considered that his reproductive coercion might have backfired in the most spectacular way possible. I heard Derek shut off the shower and quickly slipped the test results into my purse before he emerged from the bathroom. His morning routine continued exactly as always, checking his phone for messages, reviewing his calendar, reminding me about appointments or obligations he thought I might forget. Derek had no idea that the foundation of his entire manipulation had just crumbled completely. "Don't forget we have the real estate closing at 3 today," Derek said, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "I know you've had some concerns about the timing, but once we're settled in Brookfield, you'll see how perfect it is for raising a family." Raising a family. Derek was still operating under the assumption that the baby represented the successful culmination of his reproductive coercion, the permanent bond that would keep me tied to his vision of our future. He had no idea that his paternity test results had just freed me from any obligation to include him in my actual family planning. "About the closing," I said carefully, watching his reflection in the mirror, "I think we need to discuss some new information that's come to light." Derek turned to face me, his expression shifting to the patient condescension he used when he thought I was about to raise concerns he'd already dismissed. "What kind of new information?" Instead of answering directly, I pulled the paternity test results from my purse and handed them to Derek without comment. I watched his face as he read through the document, saw confusion replace confidence as he processed the clinical language and statistical certainty of his genetic exclusion. "This has to be wrong," Derek said finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. "There must be some mistake with the lab results." "There's no mistake, Derek. You're not the father of my baby." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence, and I watched Derek's entire worldview reorganize itself around this new reality. The pregnancy he'd believed was evidence of his successful manipulation had become proof of mine. The baby he'd thought would bind me to his vision of our future belonged to someone else entirely. "Who?" Derek, and the single word contained more pain than I'd ever heard from him. "Does it matter? You violated my reproductive autonomy for months, Derek. You systematically deceived me about my own medication and made choices about my body without my consent. Why would you expect loyalty or honesty in return?" Derek, face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally something that looked like genuine devastation. For the first time since I'd discovered his birth control deception, he seemed to understand that his actions had consequences beyond his control. "Chloe, we can work through this," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. We can rebuild trust and move forward together." "Rebuild trust?" I stared at him in amazement. "Derek, you've spent months lying to me about the most fundamental aspect of reproductive choice. You've made unilateral decisions about our future, dismissed my career ambitions, and tried to manipulate me into accepting a domestic role that serves your vision rather than mine. What exactly would we be rebuilding?" "Our marriage," Derek said desperately. "Our commitment to each other, our shared future, our family." "We don't have a shared future, Derek. We never did. You had a plan for my life that you were implementing without my consent or even my knowledge. That's not a marriage. That's a hostage situation." Derek's composure finally shattered completely. "You've been planning this whole thing, haven't you? The affair, the pregnancy, the partnership announcement, even suggesting the paternity test. This is all some elaborate revenge scheme, because you're angry about the birth control." Elaborate revenge scheme. Even faced with the complete collapse of his manipulation, Derek couldn't acknowledge that his actions had been wrong. Instead, he was reframing my strategic response to his reproductive coercion as vindictive plotting, positioning himself as the victim of my deception, rather than the perpetrator of his own. "This isn't revenge, Derek. This is just, you taught me that reproductive choices are weapons that can be used to control someone's future. You demonstrated that marriage doesn't require honesty or consent if one partner is clever enough to manipulate the circumstances. I simply learned from your example." "That's not the same thing," Derek protested, but his argument lacked force. "Isn't it? You switched my birth control pills to force a pregnancy that would serve your timeline and vision of our future. I made reproductive choices that serve my own goals and values. The only difference is that my deception was more successful than yours." Derek stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find some argument that would restore his sense of moral authority in the situation. Finally, he grasped for the one card he thought might still carry weight. "What about our marriage vows, Chloe? What about the promises we made to each other?" "You mean the promise to love and honor each other, the commitment to mutual respect and partnership?" "Derek, you violated every meaningful vow we made when you decided that your preferences mattered more than my consent." "I never stopped loving you," Derek said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Love doesn't give you the right to make decisions about someone else's body without their knowledge or agreement. Love doesn't justify systematic deception and manipulation. What you call love, I call control." Derek's face went pale as he finally began to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. The wife he'd thought he could manipulate and control had outmaneuvered him completely, and there was no strategy left that could restore his position of authority in our relationship. "So what happens now?" Derek asked quietly. I pulled a manila envelope from my dresser drawer and handed it to him. Inside were divorce papers that Michael Torres had prepared, along with documentation of Derek's reproductive coercion and its impact on our marriage. The legal language was precise and unforgiving, laying out a clear case for dissolution, based on irreconcilable differences and a pattern of controlling behavior. "I'm filing for divorce," I said simply. "The papers include provisions for property division, spousal support, and custody arrangements that reflect the actual circumstances of our situation." Derek's hands shook as he read through the legal documents, seeing his entire life reorganized according to someone else's strategic planning for the first time in our marriage. The house in Brookfield, the shared bank accounts, even his retirement savings, everything had been carefully analyzed and allocated according to Colorado law and the specific circumstances of our case. "You can't do this," Derek said, but his voice carried no conviction. "We can fight this. I have rights too." "Of course you have rights, Derek, but so do I, and I've spent months documenting how systematically you've violated mine. Reproductive coercion is a serious legal issue, and your behavior throughout our marriage demonstrates a pattern of control that courts take very seriously." Derek seemed to age years in the space of minutes as he processed the implications of his situation. The confident attorney who'd been planning our future according to his vision had become a defendant in a case where all the evidence supported his opponent's narrative. "The baby," Derek said, finally. "What about the baby?" "The baby will be raised by people who understand that love requires respect and consent," I replied. "James and I have discussed our future together and we're both committed to creating a family based on partnership rather than control." James Rivera. Derek's face twisted with pain as he finally understood who had replaced him in my affections and my future plans. The environmental consultant he'd dismissed as irrelevant to our marriage had become the father of the child Derek had thought would bind me to him permanently. "How long?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have James and I been together?" "About 6 months. How long have I been planning to leave you?" "Since the day I discovered what you'd done to my birth control." "How long have I been documenting your manipulation and preparing for this conversation?" "Every single day since then." Derek slumped against our bedroom wall, the fight seeming to drain out of him as he finally grasped the completeness of his defeat. The woman he'd thought he could control and manipulate had been conducting her own strategic campaign while he'd been basking in his apparent success. "I never meant for things to happen this way," Derek said, but the words sounded like a script he no longer believed. "Yes, you did, Derek. You meant for me to become pregnant according to your timeline rather than mine. You meant for me to scale back my career to accommodate your vision of our domestic future. You meant for me to accept your control over my choices as the natural order of our marriage. The only thing you didn't mean was for me to be stronger and smarter than you assumed." Derek's phone rang, probably his office calling about the day's appointments, but he made no move to answer it. His entire professional confidence had been built on his ability to control outcomes through careful planning and strategic manipulation, but now he was facing a situation where someone else had outplanned and outmaneuvered him completely. "Where will you go?" Derek asked quietly. "I've already signed a lease on a condo downtown, close to my office and James's consulting firm. The move happens this weekend, while you're at your law school reunion in Chicago." Derek's eyes widened as he realized that even his travel schedule had been factored into my planning. I'd been tracking his calendar and coordinating my independence around his obligations, ensuring that the transition happened on my terms rather than his. "You've thought of everything," Derek said, and for the first time there was genuine respect in his voice rather than condescension. "I learned from an expert in strategic planning," I replied. "You taught me that successful outcomes require careful preparation and the willingness to make hard choices. I just applied those lessons to different goals than you intended." Derek nodded slowly, finally understanding that his greatest mistake had been underestimating the woman he'd tried to control. He'd assumed that marriage gave him authority over my choices, that love justified deception, and that pregnancy would trap me in his vision of our future. Instead, his manipulation had motivated me to become everything he'd never expected: strategic, independent, and absolutely unwilling to accept his control. "I should probably pack some things," Derek said, finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "Your suitcase is already in the guest room," I told him. "I've separated your belongings from mine and arranged for a moving company to handle the rest next week." Derek stared at me for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman I'd become rather than the compliant wife he'd been trying to create. "You really have thought of everything." "I had excellent motivation," I replied. "You showed me exactly what my life would become if I continued to accept your version of love and partnership." I decided I deserved better. As Derek gathered his immediate belongings and prepared to leave our home for the last time as my husband, I felt a profound sense of completion. The man who'd violated my reproductive autonomy and tried to control my future was walking out of my life forever, taking with him any power to influence my choices or limit my potential. My phone buzzed with a text from James asking about dinner plans, and I smiled as I typed back that I'd be free much earlier than expected. Tonight would be the first evening in months that I'd spend as a completely independent woman, answerable only to myself and free to build whatever future I chose. Derek paused at our bedroom door, looking back at me with an expression that mixed regret with something that might have been admiration. For what it's worth, Chloe, I really did love you. I know you did, Derek, but you loved the idea of controlling me more than you loved respecting me. That's not the kind of love I want for myself or my child. Derek nodded once and walked away, his footsteps echoing through our house until the front door closed with a finality that marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Standing alone in our bedroom, surrounded by the expensive furniture and carefully curated decor that had represented Derek's vision of success, I felt a freedom that was both exhilarating and profound. The man who'd tried to trap me through reproductive coercion had instead freed me to discover exactly how strong and capable I really was. Derek had taught me that marriage without consent was just another form of control. He'd shown me that love without respect was worth. Most importantly, he demonstrated that the only person who could be trusted with my future was me. The paternity test results lay discarded on our dresser, a small piece of paper that had changed everything. Derek had lost the baby he'd thought would bind me to him, the wife he'd assumed he could control, and the future he'd planned without my genuine consent. In return, he'd gained an education about what happened when someone underestimated a woman who'd finally learned to recognize her own worth. I picked up the test results and filed them with the other legal documents that would soon make my independence official. Then I walked downstairs to begin the process of moving forward with a life that belonged entirely to me, carrying a child who would be raised to understand that real love required respect, honesty, and the absolute certainty that no one else had the right to make choices about your body or your future. Derek had started a game he thought he'd already won, but he'd forgotten the most important rule: never underestimate your opponent. Now he knew exactly what it felt like to have someone else control the narrative, and the lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.